Yay, we actually did it. We're live. We tried to go live last week, but it didn't work out very well. The internet decided to crash on us on our first live, which really kind of stunk. So what we're doing today is we're going to be talking about world building. But before we get there, Mike and I did a Comic-Con this weekend. We were at Tyler Comic-Con in Tyler, Texas, and we had some fun there.
Yeah.
Yeah, Melanie was there, his wife, and super hubby Trevor, my husband, was there, and we just had some fun because they actually had our tables back to back, which allowed for us to, be able to talk some. So it's kind of cool.
It was. It was a lot of fun.
And one of the things we did do was we were able to have panels. And I don't
Yep.
know if you guys have been to Comic Cons or not, but they kind of set up different panels where people can talk about different things. And it was me and you and Danielle McDonough. I think I pronounced it right.
Yep.
Danielle, if not, I'm
Yep.
sorry. Um, but we were able to have a pretty good discussion on the second panel. We talked about multiple questions that people had. They could ask anything they wanted to about, the author world and writing books and stuff. And I know one of them was about our topic for today, which was world building.
We're building.
Mhm. So
Right.
can you
Yep.
did share something specific about world building? Can you share that again today for everybody who's watching?
Well, in fantasy, world building is crucial because it's what makes fantasy fantasy. Is you build a world that is unlike the world that we live in. It could be magic. It could be technology or science if you're science fiction. But in fantasy, world building is probably the most important element of of a fantasy book or novel because it's what defines the genre as fantasy. And it does make fantasy books. We discussed this. It makes the books a little bit longer than in other genres. And we discussed, for example, like in fiction, romance novels uh, are about 50% of all fiction sales, but they're about
Mhm.
10 to 20,000 word count less, 20, 30, 40, 50 pages less in length than a typical fantasy novel. Because world building occupies a little bit more time and it makes a fantasy novel, a little bit longer in length. Word count, what did we just say, between 90, 80, 90, 100,000, 110,000, something like that.
Something like that. Now, how in fantasy world building versus fiction world building, which we'll get to that in a second, how do you combat the theory that you got to get them with the hook right away? How did you work with that?
Um, fantasy, the way I write fantasy is a little bit different, I think, than what most people that are fantasy authors are, the way they write, in that world building usually is the first thing that they do. Typical fantasy novel, you're building the world. And a lot of people who don't ever read fantasy, they're not, uh, you may be 50, 100, 150 pages into the book before you've really established a storyline or the characters.
Right. And
And
and like I said, you kind of got to get your reader way before 150 pages.
oh yeah,
So,
and even fantasy readers just give up after a while. They just think, well, this we haven't got to anything interesting yet, so let's just check it, put it down and go to another book. So the books that I write, I try to have the characters and the storyline come first, so that it doesn't matter what genre you like or what you read, you can immediately identify with the characters and the storyline, and then the world building is does come along, but it's not necessarily the first thing that comes along.
right. Now, I know in fiction we actually do world build worlds too. I know my sci-fi is in the real world is where it takes place,
That's right.
but you still
Right.
have to create, a world around them. In my Team Angel series is I had to create a world around them. And so while it is loosely based on the real world scenarios, you still have to create the world that those people and those characters live in. For
Right.
example, I've had to create towns, fictional towns. So people in those towns wouldn't get mad at me, uh, and the real ones. So, you have to create your own little world and what it looks like. And I do that by kind of there's the people I center on first and the main theory behind writing that story. What's the main thing that's going to trigger pretty much the rest of the series? And
Right.
so in there, I kind of introduce pieces and parts of their world. For example, if they move to a town, I'll describe the town as they're driving in, what it looked like, and that sort of idea. But then they also get to know the world through the different characters that are in that particular place because each
Well,
place is different.
of right. And you make a good point about science fiction in that, you're actually world building there as well,
Hmm.
because you are, of course, science fiction may 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, who knows, become science fact. We've seen that happen even in our lifetimes.
Star Trek's
Right,
triggered a lot of
right,
them. Hmm.
right. We're still waiting for the transporter beams, and on all of that. But
I'll be with
uh,
Bones and not trust them. Just saying.
but it's similar in that you are also building a world in which technology that we don't have now uh, exists, or space travel, for example.
Hmm.
So, but going back to your point in the books that you've written, what I have done in the Open Portal, uh, which is the first book in the Conquest of the Veil series, is have an East Texas setting, a contemporary setting that the
Hmm.
main character starts out in, and then goes to um, a world of magic, and that sort of thing. And remember, we also discussed that, um, and you might want to, give us your insight of what we talked about in terms of how much world building is enough and how much world building is too much.
Hmm. Yeah, you
Uh,
can overdo it. One thing I loved about your series is because I have read them all and I love them. Is that how you did it? Was you did it through the eyes of the person that went from the one
right,
world to the fantasy world.
right,
So she discovered the world as the readers discovered the world, which was a very creative way of doing it. You weren't already with people already established in this world. So that's a
right,
unique way of doing it,
right,
and I really like that.
right. And if your characters, just regardless of what world you've built, your
Hmm.
characters need to be the kind, again, that you can, a bad person in contemporary world is going to kind of look like a bad person in a fantasy world. They
Hmm.
share the same characteristics, evil versus good, etc. That sort of thing. So, uh, again, I think where fantasy has gone a little bit off the rails over the last 30, 20, 30 years is that so much emphasis has been put on the world building that the story, I think, and the characters, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, has become secondary. And I,
Hmm.
don't, I think that's why fantasy is making a comeback. We know this because, it could be the DC Comics, Marvel, the superheroes, all of that, the Comic Cons
Lord
we
of the
go to,
Rings,
Lord of the
that
Rings,
yeah.
right? Yeah, but it used to be not too many, decades ago, the most popular genre. When I was growing up, you go to when we had brick and mortar bookstores. You had half of the bookstore was dedicated to science fiction and fantasy.
Hmm.
Now it's
Which are
romance. Now it's
which are
romance.
essentially two different things, but they can be blended.
They can.
For
That's
example,
true.
mine is actually sci-fi, and it has to do with children with gifts.
Right.
On the flip side, yours is actual fantasy, as in you go to a completely different world. And
Right.
so there is a difference between the two. However, they can be blended together. That
Right.
is possible to
Right.
do both. And so a lot of times people will blend the two, and sometimes I've heard authors kind of dig on something. Mine's sci-fi only, and it's like, well, no, there's kind of elements of fantasy and sci-fi within both of them.
There is.
Um,
You're right.
and some are wholly a hybrid. Some lean more
Right.
toward sci-fi, which is what mine does, and some lean more toward fantasy, which is what yours does. And
Right.
so, being an author, if you can weave different parts of a story that are character centered, you can do creative ways of showing the world around them.
Right.
Especially like I said, like how you did it, where you have somebody from Earth who's going to this other planet called Meredith, and she's never been there. And it's where, magic replaces technology. So, this is like a whole new world for her. And she has to figure out, first of all, who she is. Second of all, how she got there. And third of all, what is going on around her?
Right. Right. Yeah. And that's hopefully as important or more important than the world building itself.
Mhm,
It would be no different than if you took somebody from, for example, where we live in East Texas, and plunked them right down in the middle of China,
mhm.
and they would
It's a
be
whole
a
new world.
fish out of water, and learning their way. One thing we didn't talk about at the author panel that we talked about world building yesterday at the Tyler Comic Con. One of the things we didn't talk about was, or didn't touch on much, was the rules
Mhm.
uh, in the worlds, that we create. And
Right.
I kind of thought about that afterwards, after we'd concluded the panel, and I was thinking, that's important too, because it doesn't really matter what world you built.
Mhm,
Those rules have to make sense to the reader. They have
mhm.
to be consistent. They have to make sense. I
And
think of
consistency is key because when you start to
right,
mess with the consistency of it, then you're kind of
right.
defeating the whole new world perspective.
I think of Tolkien's classic novel, Lord of the Rings, and seven kings. Remember, each have
Mhm,
had a ring, but what was the rule? One ring to rule them all.
mhm.
And see, that's the kind of rules that in fantasy, you have to adhere to consistency, as you said. They have to make sense, and they can't be so. And I say maybe that's for me anyway, but they can't be so convoluted and uh, just just unbelievable that
Mhm,
that it just doesn't click with the reader, because even in fantasy you do have limits
mhm.
on the so-called rules, but
Yeah, well, and when you're writing different characters, different people, people are at their core. It doesn't matter if they're centaurs, doesn't matter if they're, you know what I mean? They can be different fantasy people are people, and their personalities are all, uniquely different from each other. And as I said yesterday, never write against the character of a character because that's super important. So you have your rules for your world, but you also have your rules for your own individual characters. And
right,
when you're writing them, you know, they're gonna react. People react, humans react in a way, and when they're inherently human or when even centaurs, they're still gonna have, usually they're kind of more portrayed as passion driven.
right,
And so, then there are others who may be heart driven. And so it's like you have to stay within those elements of what that particular species, for lack of another word, is like. So if you have a centaur who's heart driven, well, that's kind of along the lines of passion. You're generally not going to have like this super intellectual centaur. You know what I mean? You
right,
can, but you're not normally going to because they're more the warriors.
right, right, right,
And so you kind of got to stay in that because culture does play a factor within the different species and in the
right.
different realms. One realm may have this set of rules and one may have another, and it might have to do with class levels, you
Well,
know?
one of the things we talked about and we didn't talk about a lot was, gaming is a huge
Mhm,
uh, that's a huge industry, and you've met gamers, and
mhm,
I've met them as well, and they basically are following the same kinds of framework that a author would follow
mhm.
writing a fantasy novel, because
Exactly.
you have characters, you have hard and fast rules. That's part of the game. If you reach, if it's a quest or something, you get to this point in the quest, you get maybe extra powers or extra abilities and that
Mm,
sort of thing. But they have characters, they have rules, they have a story basically that they follow.
mhm. And you
So
have to stay within there, otherwise you're breaking your own rules and the reader's gonna go,
right,
"This doesn't make sense."
right. Or
But
if it's a gamer, it's that, well, this, they're not doing what, this is crap, this not working. It's not what they said it was going to do or
mhm.
what it was going to be. So yeah, you're
And a
right.
lot of times gamers like, "Well, I don't know how you write." Well, technically, you just built a world by yourself. You just have to remember how you started that world. What did it look like and the different levels of how you put it in there? You start with your characters. Then you move on to your realm, and then you move on to building the world around it and how
Right.
you acquire this and how you acquire, whatever powers, how you acquire whatever it is. There is a storyline behind it. It's
Of
just
course.
it's just a visual storytelling
Right.
that you have more control over as the gamer versus, reading
Right.
a book as an author. But our job is to portray it to the point that the reader can see it in their mind and they can experience that world in their mind.
Right.
For example, in mine, the kids each have gifts. So the question is, there is also a group of youth who do not, who befriend them. And the question is, what would you do if you had this type of gift? There's also nature versus nurture. How did they grow up? How were they taught to use that gift? And the other flip side of it is the youth group kids, they have gifts of their own. They're not the
Right.
gifts like the telekinesis and telepathy and empath and precog sort of gifts. But, every person has some sort of gift. Strangely enough, organization administration is a gift. You've got gifts of
That seems to have escaped me, but
insight.
I'm but
You have
anyway,
gifts
yeah.
of like insight. Some people are more in tune to other people's feelings. So there's different gifts that people as people themselves are, but it's kind of fun to get lost in a world where the gifts are a little bit more pronounced.
Right. One of the things you mentioned at the author panel, which I thought was what's important for all writing, all
Mhm.
authors, and you had mentioned show versus tell, or tell
Mhm.
versus show.
Show versus
And
tell, yep.
yeah, and of course, any genre, any book, anything that you write, whether it's a novella, a full-length novel, whatever, that's a classic mistake that a lot of, especially new authors, make, is that
Mm.
they're they're telling, they're not showing. But so it's important to all books, all genres, but it's really important for fantasy because remember, you have built a world. You're
Mhm.
having to show the world to the reader. You can't just tell them. If you just,
Yeah.
I mean, that's not how world building works. And I don't know if you, um, that was a that was a mistake when I first started writing that I made. I was doing too much telling, not enough showing, and I don't know if you had experienced that problem, but it really does uh, hurt your, especially with fantasy novels,
Mhm.
science fiction novels. It really does take away from the writing.
Now, I'm gonna explain the difference for those who aren't aware. You
Okay.
need to show, don't tell. What that means, because some authors are even just like, "I don't know what you mean by that," because to me, they're the same
Hmm.
thing. They're not. It's the difference between she walked into a warehouse and she was afraid versus she opened the door, the smell of the boxes mixed with the chemicals, stung her senses. She nervously took a step forward, her heart racing, but she had to find him, and
Right.
she knew he was in that warehouse. So the difference is telling the story and telling the reader how to feel versus showing the reader how the main character is feeling and allowing them to experience it for themselves.
Right. Right. Like you
There's
said, she
huge
walked
difference.
she walked into the room and she was afraid. Well, you're
Mhm,
telling that,
mhm,
but the show, as you said with the show, why is she afraid? Well, you have to show that she walked into the room and a three-headed green monster with slavering jaws snapping at her, and she was, that shows you that why a person would be afraid, and it's a very easy uh, trap to fall
mhm.
into
Like, for
as
that
a
one, I
writer.
woulda
Yes,
said she carefully opened the door, heart racing, she walked in. All of a sudden, she saw a dr something drop right in front of her, and she looked up and saw this
right.
monster, three-headed monster drooling. She felt her hot breath, bring in all of the senses into something that's a new environment.
I think in terms the what helps me is if you when you're writing, if you get to the show versus tell, where you're telling the story but you're not necessarily showing it. Think of movies.
Mhm,
Uh, One of my all-time favorite science fiction movies was Alien, and I remember one of the members of the crew in the original movie Aliens. He was in the storage warehouse part of their ship, and a glob of saliva-like goo fell at his feet, and he
Mhm.
looks up, and there's the alien looking at him. Now that
Yeah.
is showing.
You got now that's telling. You gotta put
Yeah,
it right
yeah,
in front of them, and you gotta let them
right.
feel it. And that's the beauty
Yeah,
of movies is because you are going with that character, and that's the same type of feeling that you have to be able to hit with the reader. You have to reach the reader at their core. It doesn't matter if it's in a fantasy, a sci-fi, a regular fiction, a romance. You gotta if I tell people, if I can make you laugh and cry in the same book, I have succeeded. Because that
right,
means I've reached an emotional level that you have connected with the character properly.
right,
And
right.
that's what you need to reach regardless. But when you're specifically world building, don't put it all up front. Let the people discover it a little bit at a time throughout the story. It's
That's a
kind
good
of
point.
like describing a character. She was blonde hair, blue eyed, 5'7", athletic frame. Or she tucked her blonde hair behind her ear. He loved the way her blue eyes sparkled. You know what I mean? Kind of the dress fit her athletic frame perfectly. So there are ways to do it as opposed to just listing it off. And
Right.
that's again the show versus tell.
I think the easiest trap to fall in when a writer, an author is, doing the telling rather than showing is with emotions, particularly with
Mhm.
emotions. Uh, she was mad.
Mhm.
She was afraid. She was impatient.
Mhm.
And instead of instead of describing, well, uh, you know, she rolled her eyes. Well, that shows you what? That's
That she's
not
usually irritated.
right. Or you know, bit her lip rather than say something.
Mhm.
It's just, but emotions are often, and I'm a part of a critique group that I'm with. Uh, that's something we find with each other's writing quite a
Mhm.
bit is that emotions tend to be very easy to to just gloss over and tell rather than actually showing them. But it's it
There's yeah,
really
there's a
takes away from the depth of the character that you're trying to describe, and it's
yeah.
it's it's la- it's lazy writing. I'm sorry,
There's
it's
a
just the way to
really
describe
great
it.
tool, and it's literally called an emotional thesaurus, and I have it.
Right.
I have it on my Kindle, and I actually have it in my computer bag with my computer.
I think
And when do you have it on hand?
I
When
do.
I'm doing my writing,
This it
that's one of yes,
the
that's one of
emotion
my
thesaurus.
the
Right.
emotion thesaurus. And so if you open up one of them to say surprised, because surprise is one that's usually most
Sure.
often used, and just kind of read a few of the lines on there to help people kind of understand what is an emotional thesaurus. You literally look up the emotion and then they give you suggestions for it.
Right. So surprise shock. This is just a few examples. The mouth falling open, a hand flying to the chest,
Mhm,
fingers touching parted lips, a
mhm,
gasp, an incredulous stare or dazed look, jerking the head back.
mhm.
There's numerous examples,
Yeah.
and that's kind of I keep that right next to me on. And the by the way, the author, to give her credit, is Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi. I don't know if
Yes.
you can
So
see
make
that.
sure writers find this, especially if you're writing fiction, because that is like an invaluable tool.
Right,
I got it on my Kindle and I'm like, oh, no, 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 no. I need to actually have this physical book because, I can't move fast enough through the Kindle sometimes. But the Kindle is also good if
right,
you're looking for a specific one. But you kind of have to have access to online in order to pull it up with the Kindle.
right,
That's why I rather have a physical book because there are times where the internet is a little bit too distracting. But when you're doing it, there are times where I'll turn to my husband and I go, "How would I write this?" And he kind of go, "Well, maybe kind of something like this or this." Or for example, marshmallows. They roasted marshmallows in the sci-fi one, and the kids had never seen a marshmallow, so they're like, "Well, what does it taste like?" So I asked my husband, "What does a marshmallow taste like?" So it's like you have to actually put them in the world and in the experience with whoever your character is. But here's another thing that I like to do. For the sci-fi one, I actually got the pictures of the characters from Dreamtime. I paid for the pictures that are in there because sometimes describing a character, especially if you have multiple characters and multiple sets of characters, it's a lot easier for somebody to keep track of if there's a character chart. Now, I know sometimes world builders like to start with a map. Did you do that?
Yes, I did.
And how do you come up with a map? Because I know Lord of the Rings has a map. And so it's like, how do you, when you're going to create this world, if you start with the map and then kind of build around this map and the different towns in it, it's kind of like there is a game that they do that in, and I can't remember what it's called. It's Mind Quest or something like that.
Okay.
I can't remember what it is, but it's like where they build the world itself. But even something as simple as Oregon Trail, you're building your world when you get stuck, when you get landed, wherever you're going to land. You start building your farm, you start building your lands. And it's the same idea when you're writing a story. So,
Right.
from writing a map perspective, how do you come up with that map?
How did I come up with the map for,
Mhm.
okay, the Conquest of the Veil? Well, uh, my my wife's cousin is a professional artist.
Mhm.
So she also did illustrations, which is another form of showing in the open portal. Yes, yes. Uh, it's not a graphic novel. You know, graphic novels just have, they're one image after another, almost like a comic book
Comic books.
on
Mhm.
steroids.
Mhm.
But it was at crucial points in the story where the reader has read about this and now they might see a picture of a character or a scene, which helps solidify or cement the image. But the maps, I discussed it with her. I kind of had an idea in my mind. I've got the map here. I don't know how well we can see it on the uh, on our view here, but um, it. Can you see that?
Yeah,
See, am I
actually.
doing it right?
Come the other way. Nope, other way.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. So yeah, there we
There you
go.
go.
So do you see the sort of halo-like circle that sort of
Mhm.
goes through it? Because in the open portal, you have a barrier of magic called the veil that partitions this world into a good and evil half. I wanted the reader to be able to sort of see that, but not, but how do you get that on a map? You
Mhm.
know what I'm saying? So she
Sometimes
actually,
you have to have the visual for them to help them.
well, she's the one that came up with that. And if you open and look at the map, you can actually see the the partition. It's not 3D, but she did a really good job. Very gifted
Mhm.
artist, but she helped me with that.
Mhm.
Because she was going to make the map, and we talked about it, and we came up. You know how fantasies. You wanted the you don't want just a boring map, but you want something that people can look at when they read the book to sort of if they're give them direction more again visual of what's going on.
Mhm.
And she did a really good job.
Good.
Uh, by
Well,
the
and
way,
the artist
by
name
the
is
way,
Nancy Durham,
Nancy Nancy E. Durham is the artist, and
and we're gonna have her in February actually,
we are
specifically to talk about
right,
illustrations and write
right.
and art and
We
stuff.
are.
So, well, we have just about 2 minutes left or about a minute and a half left. Is there anything you'd like to add for those who are considering writing and world building and how, how to start and where to go?
Well, depends. We talked. We'll have. That's probably an episode we're going to talk about at some point in the future between pantsers and planners. Okay.
Mhm.
The thing is, if you have a good idea for a story, if you have a good story, that is the most important thing of all.
Mhm.
And you can learn to write that story. Writers organizations, conferences, things like that. But you can't learn a good story. That has to be
Mhm.
something that you have in your head and your mind. So if you've got a good story, you've already off to a great start.
Definitely. And don't give it all at once. Kind of like short foreshadowing. You're not going to give everything at once in the beginning of the story. You got to slowly let it happen and let the reader experience the world, centering mostly on the characters and how, they function in this world, whether they're already in it or whether they move to it, and how they do it, and just kind of let them experience it along with the reader.
Right. And we talked about this. You have to have a thick skin as a
Mhm.
writer, whether you just started writing or you've been doing it for a long time, because nobody is born just running out of the gate. You
Definitely.
have to learn how to do these things, and it
And
takes, constructive criticisms at times.
and just know the difference between destructive and constructive.
Good point. Maybe another topic for discussion at some point in
There
the
you go.
future. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for watching Book World: The Great Escape, Episode 2, World Building. We'll be here again next week at 11 o'clock, which I believe we're going to be doing some book reviews, our first book reviews. And I have a really spooky one for October coming. So, in the meantime, and know that come our second season, just to give everybody a quick heads up, come our second season starting in January, we're going to be moving to Wednesdays at 11. So make
Yep.
sure you have that on your calendar. We had a slight scheduling conflict, so we want to make sure that everybody's aware of that move far ahead of time. So you know, come January, we're going to be Wednesdays at 11 o'clock instead of Mondays. In the meantime, we will see you guys all next week for Book World: The Great Escape. I'm C.J. Peterson, and that's Mr. Michael Scott Clifton. And we will be talking reviews next week. We'll see you then. Bye.
See ya. Bye bye.